Hi, Misha here. Last time we compared the X-Wing and the TIE Fighter, and I had a couple of pretty decent-sized diecast models from the Hot Wheels Elite line or series. This time we're going to go much larger in ship class, but a little bit smaller in model scale size. We're going to compare the Imperial Star Destroyer to the Mon Calamari MC80 Cruiser. So, Imperial versus Rebel. And I have 6 models laid out here in total. We have the standard Hot Wheels line. This doesn't stand on the carpet well. This one does. Here's the Mon Cal and that. And behind them we have the older Agostini line. The Hot Wheels line, these are all diecast. The Hot Wheels line's more of a toy or miniature collectible thing, but they're inexpensive, $5. The Agostinis, they're more like your Eagle Moss. They come with a nice stand. They come actually with these display cases, even with a little kind of battle scene in the back. And they come with a magazine. And they cost $20. Maybe a little more nowadays. So you get more, but they do cost more. Size-wise, they're actually about the same. Maybe with the Agostini being just a hair smaller. Maybe. It seems like on the MC80s, the Hot Wheels is just a tenth of an inch bigger. But they're very close. They're very comparable. But we'll look closer at the models and at the tech specs. So, let's begin with probably one of the most iconic ships from Star Wars. The Imperial Star Destroyer Mark I, or just ISD-1. This took over from the Venator Star Destroyer, or Carrier, which we will definitely talk about, because if you've watched my Japanese World War II videos, you know I really like aircraft carriers, and that continues on to space carriers. But that, the Venator, was a Clone Wars era capital ship, and it was designed primarily as a carrier with fighting battleship stuff as a secondary role. With the Imperial Star Destroyer, and I know some called this the Imperator, but this was always the Imperial Star Destroyer when I was a kid. They tried to have more of an all-in-one thing. Plus, they knew at the end of the Clone Wars, by they I mean Palpatine, Sheev, knew that the role would change. This would be a force projection, a fear, but also it would be more of a police vessel, an interdicting vessel, a patrol ship. It would no longer be going up against massive resistance, he thought, because that was over. It would be smugglers, pirates, little pockets. And that's really where they started. They worked on these towards the end of the Clone War, and they started to field them right at the end or right after. And the first ISD ones were used to mop up remaining separatist pockets. After that, they were used to kind of just project power, law and order, and the new Imperial will across the galaxy, which galaxy is very large. Now, according to some sources, the galaxy in Star Wars is a different size than ours, but roughly speaking, our galaxy would take about 200,000 light years to make a circuit. So that's a lot of space, a lot of systems. These would be designed and built primarily by Kuwait drive yards, although of course there would be many subcontractors, and it was a large ship. Nearly a mile, in fact, 1,600 meters long, meaning it was over 400 meters longer than the Venator. It had a crew of 37,000 roughly, over 9,000 officers, and nearly 28,000, as it happens, enlisted. Plus, as the wiki says, it can carry passengers, i.e. stormtroopers, which makes it sound like they're on a voluntary cruise. Anyway, which is funny. It can carry nearly 10,000 stormtroopers. And it has enough consumables to keep them in space and fed and whatnot for up to 2 years. So a pretty massive thing, nearly 50,000 people on board all told, if fully max capacity. Now, the Venator could carry anywhere from 200 to 400 fighters. The Star Destroyer was quite a bit less. In fact, the standard complement was only 72 TIE. And of these, the common loadout was 48 of the standard TIE fighter, the TIE LN, 12 TIE interceptors, and 12 TIE bombers. It doesn't sound bad, but that actually is very World War II scaling there. If you look at, again, Japanese or American carriers, they carried around 70 craft. It also could carry 15 assault transports or troop transports, and 8 Lambda shuttles, the famous shuttle from Return of the Jedi. Actually, we do see coming out of one of these. Additionally, it could carry 20 AT-ATs. Yeah, I don't say AT-AT. That I don't know. It's my thing. Mostly because they could also carry 30 AT-STs, and everyone says AT-STs, and my brain needs things to be, yeah. And a few other auxiliary craft besides. So it was large, and it was also well armed. Now, there is the Imperial Mark I and Imperial Mark II, ISD-1, ISD-2. We'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But generally, the layout was 60 heavy turbo lasers, 60 ion cannons, and believe it or not, it's very important, 10 tractor beam emitters. Again, this was a police craft, so it was a way to slow craft down, hold them down, and they could be used even more offensively, but the tractor beams were very important. And there was other weapons utilized, medium turbo lasers, some point defense. Again, we'll talk more when we get to the ISD-2 about that. It had, of course, shield generators. It had a total of 7 engines. The 3 large ones are the primary engines. The 4 small ones are kind of secondary. They're especially important if it's doing atmospheric flight. These could go in atmosphere, but they had to pretty much just brute force it. So, kind of like the F-4 Phantom. And they could achieve nearly 1,000 miles per hour in atmosphere. Not bad for something a mile long. They had redundant shield generators, 3 of them, typically one on kind of around each tip. A lot of people will say that these bulbs on top are shield generators. They don't seem to be. They actually seem to be sensors or communication arrays, which makes a lot more sense. There's really only the one massive bay for the TIE fighters underneath, where they kind of come down and launch in little racks. There's also a secondary bay further forward for things like shuttles. And these have a very large, very massive power core. So much so that it runs vertically and kind of, you can see where it sticks out the top here a bit. It runs all the way through the hull to where the stand plugs in, but there's that bulb on the bottom of the Star Destroyer. That's the bottom of the power core unit. The reactor unit. And so, yeah, they started producing these en masse, and they were the main craft before and during the rebellion. And the last Imperial I to be produced was the Devastator, used by Vader, the one we see in the opening scene of A New Hope, or just Star Wars as it was known back then. After that, though, they would switch to the Imperial II. After the Devastator came out of the shipyards, that was about 5 years before the Battle of Yavin, BBY. they switched to the Imperial II. And the differences are slight. Now, there's a real-world explanation. A New Hope, we had one model, relatively small for the Star Destroyer, and kind of a very white, off-white paint scheme. For the Empire Strikes Back, that would feature more Star Destroyers and with more budget, they went to a larger model with internal lighting and other nice things. And there were a few differences in the detailing, so there was a different appearance, including having what some say is more of a gray finish, others say no, it's just lighting. Doesn't matter. Two different studio models with slightly different detailing. And the explanation in universe is they switched from the original Mark I to the Mark II. Aside from perhaps a color difference, the bridge would be a little different. They would relocate one of the tractor emitters, making room for a new communications system, long-range communications. They would also move some of the turbo lasers up higher on the body to give them a better firing arc. And some sources say that they actually removed the point defense laser systems. There was a set in the front and in the back, and replaced them with quad laser heavy batteries. Others say no, doesn't matter. There were also some medium lasers featured on the Star Destroyers, as well as a couple of triple batteries. I didn't mention earlier, but I told you they had 60 turbo lasers and 60 ion cannons. They also have 6 heavy double turbo laser batteries, kind of for really walloping, and 2 heavy dual ion cannon batteries, more for capturing ships, because yeah, these were meant to carry fighters. They were meant to blockade planets, as we saw many times. They were meant to bombard planets, but basically they were meant to capture, not necessarily always destroy, enemies of the Empire. So the ISD-2 took over, and many of the older ISD-1s were updated, at least to some extent. And these were the mainstay of the Imperial fleet. They were reasonably fast for the size of the galaxy. They had a Class 2 hyperdrive with a Class 8 backup, which is reasonably fast for a backup. Class 2 is not too slow for what they are. And yeah, they just kind of became the force projection for the Empire. And they tried to make it everything in one ship, and that did lead to some criticism. One size fits all never works perfectly. In theory, these were supposed to operate in fleets with support ships, smaller craft, what have you. In practice, they often just did not, either operating solo or in groups of 3. Sometimes running into an asteroid field and breaking parts of themselves off. But either way, it was the mainstay of the fleet, and a common number at the height, around, say, 3-4 ABY after the Battle of Yavin, was 25,000 Star Destroyers in Imperial service, which sounds crazy high, and it always did to me too, but when you consider how large a galaxy is, that would still only be one Star Destroyer for several hundred planets. And that was kind of the problem with the Empire, trying to forcibly control something so big. You just, yeah, the assets needed. Well, they did not expect a massive resistance in the Empire. And for about 20 years, they really did not have one. But beginning really at Yavin and running through Endor, the rebellion rose and really threatened. But they first did not have something to go up against the Star Destroyer. But that would change with the Mon Calamari. The MC80, very different origin to the Star Destroyer. The Star Destroyer was obviously a purpose-built police, military enforcement ship. Not the Mon Cal cruisers. The different legends, canons, all this stuff, I disagree a little bit on exactly how they came to be military hardware, but all sources agree they started off as civilian ships. Some people even say city ships, built by the aquatic Mon Cal. And they were allowed to be built even after the end of the Clone Wars, because that's what they were. They were various levels of civilian ship. But because of aggression and xenophobia against the Mon Calamari, shortly before the Battle of Yavin, if you trickled over to the rebellion, like the MC-75, Admiral Raz's ship, and after the events at Skaro, yeah, I know what I said. I'm moving on. I think it's funny. The Mon Cal pretty much fully committed and donated what ships they could to the rebellion, because the Empire was basically coming in force and blockading and trying to conquer their planet. And thus, between Zero and the Battle of Endor, this became the backbone, the capital ship in the Rebel fleet. As I talked about in the X-Wing TIE Fighter video, in the beginning they didn't rely on carrier ships because they did have fighters with hyperdrive. But after Hoth and their ground base, or well, I should say after Yavin and Hoth, 2 ground bases had been discovered and wiped out, they kind of figured, okay, maybe having a mobile base, mobile command center, a large capital ship grouping wouldn't be such a bad idea. So kind of started off with this very simplistic model of a generic MC80 from the Hot Wheels line. But let's look at the Agostinis. By the way, the Mon Cals, there was never a standard assembly. These were built by artists. So every Mon Cal cruiser is unique and different. So it's really hard to pin down exact specs. For example, it's often said that 1,200 meters is the average length, but some are 1,000, some are 1,400, and some are as much as 1,500 meters long. So almost a Star Destroyer. So all kind of things change on these. But let's look at the most common type used. The MC80 so-called Liberty type. It's got wings. This was the most common variant. Even that said, there were variations within. Roughly speaking, it would have a crew of 5,400, with about 650 of those being officers. And since these were originally designed for the Mon Cal, the bridge crew, the instruments, the controls, the displays had to be run by them, so the officers were often Mon Cal. It could also carry about 1,200 passengers. These designs were originally built as starliners, passenger liners, kind of luxury cruise ships of the stars, if you will. So the basic space frames were there, and since the Mon Cal were aquatic, they were designed where they could go underwater. Thus, they were originally built with very strong space frames and reinforced armored hulls, and good shielding, because you want to keep your passengers safe. So it was a pretty quick and easy thing to retrofit them with weapons pods, and that's what they did. These wings especially are used for the weapons pods. They would end up with very advanced shielding, 2 to 3 shield generators that would overlap and quickly recharge. This particular version had 9 different engines, different sizes in the back here. There was also a version of this scene without the wings. So it had the engines kind of in a row down below, but no wings. And going up against the Star Destroyer, this had better shielding and a generally stronger hull, with things like the bridge better protected. However, on the offensive front, it was still a little bit weaker. It had 48 dual heavy turbo laser batteries, so not bad, but a little less than the Star Destroyer. Only had 20 or so ion cannons. One thing it had that the Star Destroyer did not, it could launch ordnance, bombs, torpedoes. At least some Mon Cals could. Interestingly, the Venator Star Destroyer could launch ordnance, but with the Star Destroyer, the Imperial, they kind of got away from this because they didn't feel like they would be engaging large capital ships. But the Mon Cal knew they would, so at least some of these were fitted with launchers. And they had tractor beam emitters, but only 4 to 6, so a little bit less on the tractor beam. So the basic takeaway is smaller crew, so that's usually a positive, easier to operate. Weaker offense than a Star Destroyer, but better defense. What about carrying capacity? These had large shuttle bays, and they were more multi-role, multi-purpose than the more dedicated bays on the Star Destroyers. This type, the Liberty type, routinely could carry about 3 wings, so about 36 starfighters, typically X-Wing, Y-Wing, and A-Wing. Although they could easily carry up to 48 if the vessels were available. They could also carry a more varied range of utility craft, freight craft, support craft, a couple of those. And when you consider that one X-Wing is worth at least 2 TIE fighters, I would say at the very least they're equal in their fighter support to a Star Destroyer, keeping in mind too that other ships could just travel alongside it in hyperspace. By the way, these also had 2 years of consumables, just like the Star Destroyer. Speed-wise, it's kind of interesting. Star Destroyer had a Class 2. The Mon Cal here has a Class 1 hyperdrive, so it's faster. Star Destroyer, though, has a Class 8 backup. The Mon Cal has a slower Class 9 backup. But then again, since it's better shielded, better armored, the chances of its primary going out are less. They're very interesting ships. They're very organic in the real world. That's what they made them for the Empire Strikes. Excuse me, for the Return of the Jedi and end of Empire Strikes Back. They wanted something very bubbly, and yeah, there's no real design. But if there's a general class, that would be it here. The Liberator, excuse me, the Liberty type. And this is one of the first victims of the second Death Star as well. So let's look at the other major type. This is the MC80 so-called Home One variant, or sometimes called the Command Cruiser. Like the Liberty type, it's classified as a heavy space cruiser. Whereas the Liberty started off life as a passenger liner, starliner, these actually started off life as deep space exploration and scientific cruisers. But they too were brought into the fold of the rebellion. We know at least 7 served. They didn't have as many of these as they did the Liberty type, but these were more powerful, a little more versatile, especially in the hangar area, and had more firepower. Originally, after Yavin, it was the Independence that was the flagship, and then after Hoth, this vessel here, Home One, became the flagship. Crew is only slightly more, at about 5,500. These still have to be controlled by the Mon Calamari. Still have the same passenger capacity. They have more ion cannons at 36, and depending on the exact version, they have between 29 and 36 heavy dual turbo lasers. They also have a large number of quad laser mounts. And one thing to point out, the Mon Cal cruisers did not have a dedicated point defense system, so kind of like the ISD-2, but they had advanced targeting systems that allowed them to use their lasers pretty effectively to take out fighters. They could also be used for planetary bombardment and what have you. The bays in these are interesting. The original Independence only had 2 squadrons, X-Wings, or X-Wing, Y-Wing mix. But this was because it was a command cruiser early on, and they were pretty limited in the Rebellion. But some of this type were known to carry up to 10 squadrons, 120 fighters, and this type was the first to carry the new B-1 bomber, or assault fighter. It could also carry a wide range of shuttles, landing craft, what have you. It too had 6 tractor beam emitters like the Liberty, although these are classified as heavy tractor beam emitters, so a little more powerful perhaps. And that's the general takeaway. The Home One type, the Command type, a little more powerful than the Liberty, but less common. And again, this is what Akbar would use at Endor. And unlike many of the other cruisers there, this would survive. And this class of MC80 would pretty much be the backbone of the Rebel, later New Republic fleet up until about 10 years after Yavin, when it would start to be phased out in favor of newer ships like the MC80B. The big difference there was the B was designed as a warship from the outset and designed where Mon Cal and other species could use it from the outset. And later on that would evolve into the MC90 series as well. You can see this has a different engine arrangement in the back here. It uses a total of, at the back, uses a total of 10 engines, 4 large heavy ones, and 6 smaller ones for kind of maneuvering and backup. And these are atmospheric capable. They're even able to be submerged. And there you have it. Let's talk about models and kind of do a final comparison. In universe, the Mon Cal was certainly a more efficient cruiser. The Star Destroyer cost 150 million credits to build and had a crew of 37,000 and needed a lot of that to operate. The Liberty type here cost just over 100 million credits, and the Home One type was about 112 to 115 million credits, so both considerably cheaper. They already had much smaller crews, 5,400, 5,500, and it's noted that they can operate with as few as 1,200. So, fewer credits, fewer time to build, more durable hull. The trade-off, of course, is the Star Destroyer has more intimidation and probably more of a ground assault ability carrying AT-AT, AT-STs. But on the other hand, these can carry not just more fighters in the case of this, but higher quality ones and a more flexible bay. On the other hand, the Empire had 25,000 of these. And we don't have an exact number for the Rebellion, but could have been as few as 7 of these and a dozen of these. At most, I can't imagine they had more than 100, so hugely outnumbered. But then again, they weren't trying to conquer a galaxy and defend and control a galaxy. Totally different mindsets. In the Mon Cal, it's just more of an efficient design. But then again, the Star Destroyers were constructed in such a way that they could be cranked out by shipyards. So as far as the models, I brought out both of these Hot Wheels to show you something. This is an earlier release in this mold. It's not bad. It's for the money. This is all metal. The tip is plastic, but this body's metal. But if you look back here, there's very little detailing in the rear. They corrected this with later releases, the ones like these that come with the stand. They added considerably more detailing in the back. Also a little bit more on the bridge area there. So that's nice. A little correction that someone made. But of course the Agostini has a kind of softer detailing in some areas, like on the bridge, and a little more going on in some areas in the back, like the engines stick out a little more, and kind of a little more of the harder definition there. Also the shuttle bay, or the tie bay I should say, is a little more indented versus these. It's kind of shallow on these, but it does have the patterning. And the edges are a little different. This has more distinctive kind of inlets here, whereas the Agostini is a little bit softer on those inlets, which to me seems a little more correct. So certainly a higher quality. And this is all metal, the whole darn thing. I think even the bridge is. And again, it comes with a nice little display case and magazine. But it costs 4 times as much. These come with a perfectly decent stand, and they plug on very well. You can pull them off, and then plug this into your power core, and they don't come off. Moving over here, kind of the same thing continues with these two Agostinis. I really am happy they did both styles. Again, there was even a third one where they did pretty much this wing style, but they pulled the wings off. But Mon Cal cruisers are not produced in large numbers in different models. They tend to get overlooked. I think the rounded shapes are more difficult to do. And so, even though this is not a great model, at least they made a Mon Cal. And, you know, cheap enough. Comparing it to the Agostini here, the Hot Wheels is a little wider, the Agostini is a little bit longer, but again, since there was no standard hull for these, we can just say this is another MC80 variant. It is what it is. So yeah, Mon Cal versus Star Destroyer. I think all in all, the Rebel design is probably a better ship. It's just they didn't have enough of them, or the ability to build them very quickly. Whereas the Star Destroyer was just as much of a psychological weapon as it was a real machine. Just kind of crazy, the crew requirements. Very massive crew. Alrighty, folks. Appreciate you tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this. If you could, like, share, and subscribe, and feel free to comment below. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.